Hi, and welcome to my sci-fi, fantasy, and horror short fiction roundup for December 2021, which is full of stories I read and loved in December last year. And I'm going to dive right in. I got 14 stories, I think, for this roundup. And if you want more short fiction, you can also check out my recommended reading list for 2021 at Maria's Reading. And later this month, in January 2022, I'll have my short fiction treasures column at Strange Horizons. So check that out if you're interested. So we'll dive right into December Roundup. My first story pick is Red is Our Country by Philip Haidar Drovacek Zorko in Lightspeed. And this is a must read. I really love this compelling, tense and taut story about an expedition to Mars that has gone very much awry and keeps getting worse for the crew. And with the Martian setting and the tone of the story's mysterious narrator, it has a bit of a Bradbury vibe, and I freaking love Bradbury, so that's good news. And as the crew struggles to complete their mission while also staying alive, they are being watched very closely by someone with their own agenda and their own territory to protect. And I was on the edge of my seat throughout this story. My next story pick is The Cold Calculations by M.A. Ogden in Clark's World. And it starts out with this line: "Once upon a time, a little girl had to die. It's just math. Wrong place, wrong time, bad luck. Too bad, so sad." Now, this story is a response to, and really an evisceration of, the well-known science fiction story, The Cold Equations, where, because of various seemingly tragic but scientifically unavoidable circumstances, a girl has to die to save others. Now, Ogden is both incisive and brilliant in her fury at this story here, picking apart those equations and circumstances of the cold equations, posing important questions about what stories we choose to tell, how we choose to tell those stories, whether they are set in the past, present, or future, and whether they are speculative or not, and about how we manipulate all the moving parts of a story, characters, science, tech, etc., in order to tell the story we want to tell. This is a passionate and profoundly thought-provoking read about history, future, power, storytelling, science, community, and characters. My next story pick is Stolen Property by Sarah Lamparelli in Black Static, and it's the double issue 8081. This is a masterfully told horror story about a hike that goes wickedly and terribly wrong, and then gets worse in a way that keeps twisting the horror into ever stranger and ever darker places. This story grabbed me by the throat from the get-go, and it kept me there until the end. It's about two men who are on a hike far out in the wilderness, and they don't really know each other, having met in the woods. And we understand almost immediately that at least one of them, probably both of them, is not who they seem to be. Two dead bodies also turn up right from the beginning, so we know this is going nowhere good. This is definitely one of my favorite horror stories from 2021. My next story pick is Never a Gentle Master by Brittany N. Williams in Fireside. And this story is a wild, harrowing ride from start to finish. I felt like I barely breathed once while reading. Kay's family has magic, a lot of it, and when the story begins, they know they're facing trouble from a man named Qual, who has been meddling with death magic. But even knowing that, the family is not quite prepared for what happens when they and their home comes under ferocious attack. This story is strong stuff, and I wasn't quite sure just how Kay would make it out. But in the end, there is a way, one way, and she takes it. My next story pick is The Plague Puller by Manish Melwani in Nightmare. This is an unusual and tender ghost story about Ah Keng, who finds the body of his friend Leung dead from cholera in the street, and sets out to bring him safely to the house of death. It's a story set in a place ravaged by cholera where death is ever present. And for pandemic readers, there are shades of the present here for sure. Melwani captures the place in fine detail here, exploring how hard it can be to keep your humanity and to remember that the unfortunate dead were once as human as you are. King cares for his dead friend and his dead friend's ghost, just as he cared for him in life. It's a gentle, haunting tale of friendship, love, life, and death, and I love how subtly and beautifully Melwani builds the world and the characters here. My next story pick is Distant Fire of Winter Stars by Jonathan Louis Duckworth in Flash Fiction Online. This is a wonderful story about family and about coming to terms with the death of a parent. In this case, the protagonist finds themselves in dire straits in a wintry forest, but there's a bit of magic in their possession. A flask his dad gave him just before he passed away. I love the emotional tone of the story, and I love the magic woven into the everyday, and I adore the way it all pays off in the end. My next story pick is The Taurus Pilot by Megan Navarro Conley in Anathema. Anathema's latest issue dropped right on New Year's Eve, and it's full of terrific fiction, including this compelling science fiction story about a giant mech fighting machine named Bastion, and a mech pilot who has a stronger connection with Bastion than what should be technically possible. Even when their connection has been officially severed, something remains. It's a powerful story about war and how heroes are made and torn down, and about all the things you might lose in battle or afterward. My next story is also from Anathema. It's Samsima of the Zabaleen by Ramez Joachim. And this is about a girl named Samsima who grows up on the margins of a future society where most people have to scrounge for a living in a world changed by climate change. Changed and ravaged by climate change and environmental destruction. After her parents are gone, she stays in the landfill, trying to keep herself alive while waiting for them to come back. Years pass, and still she stubbornly keeps waiting and hoping and surviving against the odds. Now, I love the characters in this science fiction tale. Samsima is a stubborn soul full of strength and life, even though the world she inhabits might seem bleak and hopeless. And she never loses hope and never loses her sense of self no matter what happens. And in the midst of the landfill with all the garbage, her hope grows quite literally in an old takeout container. My next story pick is The Truth Each Carried by E. Catherine Tobler in The Bourbon Pen. If you're familiar with Tobler's Circus World stories, you might recognize some of the characters in this story, though they are all much older than when we met them in the story Blow Out the Moon in Giganotosaurus. Trudy has discovered a very special kind of magic hidden in plain sight. Some carousel and mechanical horses can be brought to life. It's an uncertain and mysterious kind of magic, but Trudy has committed her life to it. Now, death and old age are creeping up on her, and she looks back on her life and the choices she has made through the years and finds that there are new things to learn, and maybe a new kind of magic left for her to discover, and maybe an old friend too. Find more of Tobler's Circus World in the short story collection The Grand Tour and in her novella The Kraken Sea. My next story pick is also from the Bourbon Pen. It's by Louis Evans. It's Lazarus by Louis Evans. It's a surreal and claustrophobic story about a time and a place where each person's world has been shrunk to the size of barely a room, and where each day is a soul-crushing repetition of the days that came before it. And yes, this is a story about isolation during the pandemic, but it's also a story about how small and cramped and lifeless the world may seem also under other circumstances. It's a disturbing read where the longing for something more and something else is constantly gnawing at and slowly consuming the characters. My next story pick is To New Jerusalem by Farah Kader in Faya, and this is from the Palestinian issue. This is one of many great stories from Faya's special Palestinian issue, and here we find ourselves in a future racked and wrecked by climate change, flooding, and rising sea levels. The protagonist has returned to New Jerusalem, where their family once came from, and it's now an area of the submerged world, and she is wading into the water and into the past, her family's past. It's a quietly harrowing and heartbreaking story about change and loss and memory, and about how we might go looking for the past. And even though it's impossible to actually find our past, we may find memories that we can carry with us into the future. My next story pick is Storm Waters by Cindy Fan in Truancy magazine. Truancy magazine number 10 is sadly the publication's last issue, but the scene absolutely goes out with a bang, bringing us a crop of strange, twisted, sharp stories. In Fan's tale, a young boy and an old man have made a trade, and each will receive something they need and desire. It's a story that feels like an old folk tale threaded into our modern world, and I love the darkness and fierceness of its magic and of its characters. My next story pick is Some Things That Happen When You Have the Strength of 10 Men by Mel Negro in Augur 4.2. Yes, there is a new and wonderful issue of Augur magazine in the world, and I highly recommend reading every single story in it. Negro's story is one of my favorites. It's a powerful and deeply moving and emotionally charged piece about two siblings growing up together, growing apart, and finding a way back to each other. I love everything about this fierce story, and I love how deep it goes into the relationship between two siblings and a troubled family, exploring what it's like to be the strong one, the one who thinks they have to shield and protect and fix everything, and what it's like to be the younger one, the one everyone assumes is the weaker one that needs protecting. Sibling relationships are so profoundly important to many of us, and it's a real treat to read a story like this that explores the facets of such a relationship with such an empathetic and unflinching eye. My last story pick for this month is The Tinderbox by Kate Elliott at Tor.com. Now, if you, like me, like twisted and or reimagined versions of old fairy tales, then this story by Kate Elliott might be right up your alley. Here, Elliott puts a new spin and a new perspective on Hans Christian Andersen's The Tinderbox, where a soldier returning from war meets a witch and gains treasure and a very useful magical item in the process. Elliott's story essentially begins where the original story's encounter with the witch ends, with the witch beheaded, and what happens after that turns out to be part of a carefully thought out plan. I love the way the original tale is twisted and turned and amended here, and Elliott's writing, as always, is exquisite. And that's all I had for this month. Thanks so much for listening, and yeah, there'll be more next month, and you can also, like I said, check out my upcoming short fiction treasures column at Strange Horizons, or my recommended reading list for 2021 at Maria's Reading. Thanks, and hear me again.